Welcome, everybody. Tonight we're going to be working on Unit 4, and Unit 4 is the unit where we start learning about CSS. I have it labeled as CSS Basics because we are focusing on some of the more fundamental concepts here. And it's kind of a building process of basically learning, the design aspects, let's call it, of HTML. And although I'm not here to teach you how to be an artist, here's what happens in making web pages. There is artistry involved. Right? It doesn't have to be very fancy. So I get a lot of coders will come in and say, hey, I'm not an artist, I'm a coder, and I just want to do the mechanics. I really don't care what it looks like. What it looks like on the web is very important, arguably. There are some really basic principles that you can follow that make your web pages look good without a lot of effort. A lot of it involves sticking to basics and really creating good visual space around things, using high contrast and basic readable approaches, right? The web is still predominantly text, but there's a lot of visuals on the web as well. So we'll learn a little bit about placement, color theory, tools that you can use. We'll also learn how to size things, how to work with some fonts and stuff. But we have to learn about the technology first. Whenever I start teaching CSS, I always start with the Zen Garden, right? And I'm going to click on the link in just a second here, and I'm hovering over it. But I want to explain what this is. When we first had HTML was the plain, ugly HTML, like what we're doing here, like on our pages, right? Very, base level, not a lot of beauty to it, but the information got to the screen and we had links and we could look at pictures. Somebody started to realize that, okay, so if we're pushing stuff into the web browser, is there a way we could kind of make it look more like a real computer screen, or make it look prettier, or put this here and that over there and make the font bigger and color it this way, just like you would if you were doing a page layout like in a Word document. And I'm going to bring up my word processor here with intent. So when we start working in a word processor, we kind of have the same issue. Like, we can just type plain old text. But I don't know if you guys ever have noticed this inside of a word processor, but word processors have what we call style sheets. So if I want to change my text to a heading, it has a preset for it. And what you're going to notice is, like, if you dig into these style panels, that they have a whole bunch of different kind of things. And I want you to notice there's a correlation between documents and their style sheets and HTML documents. And I'm going to call them documents because that's what most people in the industry call them. And they have the same kind of features. So really where this comes from originally is mimicking the print world. So when we would print things on paper, this is just body text, and this is a quote, and this is a heading, and this is a caption, or this is a sidebar, or this is really important, so let's make it bold. And you'll notice that with all of these styles, right, that they all will have presets for like font color, font size, placement, spacing. All those things are kind of built in. When we move to a web environment, we have the same kind of control over our web pages. And even basic HTML has some styling already built into it. How do we know that? Well, this is a paragraph. So this is just plain text. And usually paragraphs are considered the plain text container. If I have a link, it underlines and it changes colors, right? If I have an H1, right, it's bigger, it's more space around it. H2, a little smaller, some space around it, and H3, and then there's a H4, 5, and 6 as well, right? And those clearly have like a bigger, bolder font, right? And spacing around them. And then you'll see other elements have their styles as well. And so those styles are built into how the browser by default handles whatever we're delivering to it. And it's part of the HTML standard, however it appears. But it is primitive still. So somebody came up with this idea, like, what if we could take our HTML pages and do what we do with documents, which is to create style sheets that define collections of styles, and we can control individual elements separately. And then even better, like once I have the styles figured out for one page, I can start to apply them to other pages and make my whole site look consistent and, more importantly, beautiful and engaging, so that people want to like be on your site and buy your products or look at your content or whatever, right? So they came up with this language called cascading style sheets. And so style sheets being just like basically word processors or the print documents, and then cascading implying how the technology works on the back end inside of HTML environments, which we'll learn about, but that's going to be one of the last topics of the night. The cascade, in essence, is which styles take precedence over other styles. So I'll show you that as we move forward. So going back here now and clicking on the Zen Garden, once CSS became active, this guy that built this website, I'm going to now visit it. You guys can do it too, right? And you go to the website and you're like, okay, well, looks like an interesting looking website. But it was an experiment basically where this guy took the content on this web page, offers up the HTML file so you can borrow his code, offers up the CSS file so you can see how he styled this page. And what I'll do here is I'll actually download that HTML file, and then I'll come here and just open it up. And this is what the web page actually looks like with no CSS attached to it. The CSS allows the web page basically to go from this to this. It is the exact same HTML file. And you have to admit, this looks much nicer, right? It's got, you know, beautiful typography. There's some backgrounds and images, and there's sidebars and all that stuff. And what this site was an experiment. So this guy said, well, here's my idea. I took this HTML code, right? This ugly HTML code. And then I attached my own style sheet to it and came up with this design. So then he put up the challenge, take my HTML file and build your CSS file and do something different with my HTML. So I want you to, this is pretty profound when you start to see some of the results of this. If you come here on the sidebar and start clicking through these, and you can do this on your own, I'm going to go through a few of them, probably not all, but most maybe. Now, take a look at this site. This is the exact same HTML, folks. The only difference is the CSS that styles the page. We have different graphics. So yes, you can load graphics through CSS. We have different typography and colors, a very different kind of layout. We have stuff that's kind of transparent and hanging over other things, and things are on sidebars, and there's big graphics, and it's, oh my gosh, like way, way different, right? Yeah. Here's another person's take on it. Notice how the content slowly faded in. That's CSS also. Right? There's kind of like this watermark in the back that doesn't move when I scroll. The navigation's on the left this time. There's a weird side column. Once again, exact same content, different CSS. Now check this one out. This one's pretty cool. Oh my God, there's animation. Yeah. Now, in the old days, we could only animate with JavaScript. And then they started adding that feature when CSS version 3 came out in the late 2000s, roughly, or 20 years ago, maybe. And so you can, and I want you to watch as I move my mouse around, how the objects react to the mouse movement. It's pretty wild. This is all done with CSS once again. I mean, what a radically different look, right? And once again, same HTML file underneath. So you can take this and turn it into this with CSS. And if you want to kind of keep like going down here, so we're on the steel one. Here's the apothecary, right? Once again, very different look and feel. Same content. Here's the screen filler. This is Fountain Kiss. Notice how some content is moving and some is not. Pretty cool. A robot named Jimmy. Emotes. Seems to be a little bit hesitant. There we go. Once again, animations. Very different typography and layout. And I'm not sure where the links are here. And I guess I'm going through all of them. and then back to his original. Now, I know for a fact this hasn't been updated probably like 10 years, you know, so the techniques on here are not even that new. But you have to admit, it's like, oh, wow, yeah, I'd rather have my webpage look like that, you know? And here's the beauty of this. When you get deep into this stuff, you can do that, right? It takes a little time and practice working with the technology to understand how it works to be able to build things like this. But the possibility is there. In addition, there are, you know, a thing that I always tell people is like, okay, well, how is it we go from this to like websites that like, you know, like Facebook or something, you know? Yeah, it's not overnight, right? It's a long building process, and there's lots of engineers working on big sites like that constantly to make them do what they do. But we have the capability and we will learn the skills, right, to do this. But a lot of people are also using what we call content management systems to publish web content, where they're really not hand coding anything. They have a framework that they work within. They load up a pre-configured theme, and then they add content to it, and they can rapidly develop websites. So a lot of the tools on that level, they're not exactly drag and drop, but they're a little bit more automated. And most of the content that we see on the web is generated that way. However, there's always room for custom coding, and some of the best websites out there are custom coded, like the little examples that we saw here. And you can see how impactful it can be, because images, typography, color, placement on the screen, animation, all those interactivity things, that they really open up a web page and make it so you want to give them your credit card info and buy a product, or stay on the website for a while and read the content, you know. So the audience is also kind of a determining factor, right? So if I was to build a website for let's say gaming, I might go with a dark theme. If I was building a website about travel, I might have a bright white theme. You know, if I had one that was about photography, it might have very few words and lots of pictures, right? So make sure you have a vision in mind, because if you don't have a vision in mind, it's harder to create what you're envisioning if you're just guessing at it, right? So when we do actually get into a couple units from now, like site design, we start like when we do with regular coding, we use pseudocoding. We think about the problem and how we solve it. With websites, we often start with a wireframe or a topic for a website, and then we can sketch out, well, I want the images to be here and the words to be here and the menu to be over there, all that kind of stuff, right? And so we envision it first, sketch it out, and then try to build it. Because if you do have a vision, it's kind of like a blueprint for a house. It's a lot easier to build it. Right. We are going to start with real basic approaches, and then as we move forward, you will find more and more ways. And I'm hoping for you that you get excited about the possibilities of what you can do with the tech, you know, as you start to learn how to use it. All right. So one of the things that I'm going to do here is I am going to use the lecture notes here as a guide for kind of driving the demos for tonight. So some of this I'm going to kind of sort of read to you, but let's talk about CSS, you know, on a fundamental level here. So it does stand for cascading style sheets, and while we can do some control over content inside of HTML and how it looks, it really is very limited, right? Obviously. What CSS allows us to do is take styling commands, and we can either add them directly to a tag, and we'll learn there's three different approaches, right, for doing it. So one is putting it in a tag, the other is putting the styles at the top of the document in the head section, and the final preferred way really is to have an external file that controls it all. And that's really the approach ultimately we'll focus on. But it's important to know the other two methods, because there are times professionally when you don't have access to the style sheet, and you can override the style sheet by putting stuff into the document directly, right? And that happens a lot more in content management systems, honestly. So it says here, CSS is used to specify the presentation and design, right? So they use, okay, for example, HTML defines the structure and content, right? It gives us the framework, the skeleton. CSS is the presentation and the design. And I would say maybe kind of behavior, like you saw, like me moving my mouse around, it reacts to it. So like the clothing and the appearance of that clothing that sits on top of the skeleton. It handles the colors, fonts, layout, the spacing, and really a whole lot more, when you start to dig into it. Cascading means that some aspects of CSS are determined to be more important than others and therefore sit higher in priority than ones below. And for example, if I add a style directly to a tag, that will take preference over an external style sheet. And then within external style sheets, there's a hierarchy as well, and so it's easy to make mistakes in style sheets. And the other thing I tell people is, like, if your HTML is not formed well, this is where you start to see it, because you think you're putting a background, let's say, on a paragraph, and all of a sudden that background's on everything. It's like, why did that happen? Because your HTML's not, the skeleton is broken, and so that color leaked out to everything, that type of thing. So a style sheet really, is really kind of a collection of different style declarations, and we usually put that in one file. When you get to really complex websites, some people will have separate style sheets for navigation, for content, for, different pages even. For most generic website work, though, it's usually the best practice to put all the styles into one style sheet. Professional developers often get to the point, and I was kind of at that point when I was doing a lot of freelance, where I would develop a library of styles and I would just put them in a file, and I would import that library of styles into every project, and I knew how to utilize it and what commands I had already created, so I could do work really quickly. And that's kind of a helpful tip, by the way. So the analogy here: if HTML is the foundation and walls of a house, CSS is the paint, wallpaper, furniture, and decorations that make the house look like a home. So let's jump over to W3 Schools here. And I am doing this through Chrome today, so we might get some ads on the screen, so I apologize for that, and I'm sure the advertisers love it. All right, so some material here, and I would encourage you to read through this stuff on your own. And you can see here at the W3 site, HTML, CSS, right? Foundational languages of the web, along with JavaScript, are the first three on the toolbar. There is a significant reference library here, and I'm just kind of very quickly scrolling through it. It even talks about like very advanced cutting edge features and what we call CSS pre-processing and things like that. We get pretty advanced. They have a little demo here too. Like, for example, and this works right in the browser here, right, where they're applying different style sheets to the same HTML code again. It just looked like how different even very simplistic things can look. So all of this is achievable with just a little bit of effort and practice. So once again, kind of not quite like the Zen garden, maybe not that impressive, but still, right, you get the idea of, like, I can take the same HTML and apply different styles, and we have something different. If you want to use the house analogy, right, have you ever been in a neighborhood where all the houses are kind of basically the same because they were built by the same builder, right? And wait, that one's got a attached garage, that one doesn't, that one's got a different roof shape, this one's got vinyl siding, that one's got aluminum siding, that one's got brick, you know what I mean? And CSS is, once again, kind of like that. The nice thing about CSS, and I want you to think about this, when we are changing styles using an external style sheet in particular, boy, that's very annoying. I'm gonna refresh that just to get rid of this. One thing that works really, really well is the fact that when you use an external style sheet, so when we put all our styles in one file, I can control an entire website with that one file. So instead of having to, like, if I had 100 pages on a website, instead of going page to page to page to page to fix all of them, I could change one line in the CSS file and affect all 100 pages at once. That's why it saves a lot of time. So when they say it saves a lot of work, Oh my God, yeah. You can, when you can change the look, feel of an entire website with hundreds of pages or thousands even with one line of code, it's amazingly powerful. So the focus really is use external style sheets, generally speaking. All right, let's move on to the next lecture topic here. So I think that's kind of a nice little intro. All right, so there's kind of this weird thing. So as we start to build external files, the one thing that we'll start to mention, and this is a phrase I do use, which is called the separation of concerns. And they're throwing JavaScript into the mix here too, and I want you guys to look at that. So HTML is the content and structure, the skeleton, and maybe the meat, of the site, the words and the images. And then CSS is used to make it look nice. And then JavaScript allows it to act like a real computer program or an app in the browser. So those three working together create very rich experiences in the browser. And once again, in this course, we're learning these two technologies. We have a whole separate standalone course on JavaScript. And then that topic goes deeper and deeper as you move forward through the program. Because we take all of those components, we have separate HTML files, separate CSS files, and separate JavaScript files. We have them separated, and that way we can focus on the individual aspects separately and not pollute the other content in the process. So it is, as it says here, easier to maintain the website. The content part of it is a lot easier to read. The pages will load faster because if you're sharing external files, if I go to one page and it loads my style sheet, when I go to the next page, it's using the same one that's already in memory. It doesn't have to download it again. In fact, it stays in your browser cache for a while too. So this is really kind of one of the advantages. So they do have a little blurb here on why use CSS, and let's see what they say about it. All right, well, saves a lot of time. I guess they're just kind of reiterating the same stuff. Why use CSS? So it's defined, it says here, it's used to define the styles for your web pages. And here's a little example. The way that CSS essentially works, and we'll get into the syntax of it here in a moment, is on like your first introduction. When I want to style the body tag, I just simply call the tag by name. So if it's a body or an H1 or a paragraph, I just list it in my style sheet. Then I set up a set of curly brackets that encapsulates all the styles for that item. Each style I'm affecting, so in this case, the background color, so that's the thing I'm trying to do, or control. And then I put in a colon, and then I indicate whatever action I'm taking to it. In this case, I'm going to make it light blue, right? And then each styling statement is terminated with a semicolon. Right? Now notice, this is a very different syntax than HTML, right? It's a completely different language. But there are these rules that you have to follow. So you have to declare what you're styling, right? Put in your curly brackets, the style item or whatever. I'm not sure what that technical name is. I'm sure we'll see it in a moment. And then the actual action that you're taking, terminated with a semicolon. If you have more than one item inside of a style declaration, that's where the semicolon is important. It is important to note, if you only have one style, you can drop the semicolon and it still works. But my strong recommendation is always include it, even if there's only one style, even if it's in line. Because if you don't, and then you add another style and stuff starts to break, then you're hunting for that semicolon. So stick with that format. Some of the things that you see here are some of the things we're working with tonight. So we're going to be looking at background colors. Color, which refers to text, by the way. You'll never see a font color. For whatever reason, it's just color, right? Aligning text, like making it left or right or center. Choosing fonts, right? We'll not going to do a super heavy unit on typography tonight, but just an intro. And then sizing your fonts as well. Those are very, very common actions. So let's take a little example tour here, right? So they have an example little mini HTML page. Here's the H1, right? They colored it white. I could make it blue, right? If I want. I don't know if that looks good or not, but notice that I can actually use plain color names to declare colors. There are also about a half dozen additional methods for declaring colors that are a little bit more technical. But when it comes to basic colors, and this is a tip I give to everybody, if you just want the words to be black or you want the text to be white, just use those words: white, black, blue, brown, green, purple, fuchsia, whatever. They do now have a library of several hundred color names that you can just use directly. And as long as you use the correct verbiage, they just work. Some of the commands, like for example, this one only has so many valid values. You can probably guess what they are. So when you align a document, how do you align it? Think of a word processor. It's left, right, center. There's also justify, a couple of other ones, but those are the basic ones, right? And for any style that you play with, what I always tell people is CSS is very complicated. There's literally thousands of style types you can choose from, and then those all have sub selections. There is absolutely no way you're going to memorize it. Don't even bother to try. What you should memorize is how to get to W3 schools to find the information if you forgot how. Like, if you don't know, it's like, how do I put a border on something? Just Google it and say W3 CSS borders, and it'll take you here, and this will show you the code and technique for doing it, right? You don't have to retain it in your brain. You do get to learn some of them, just by virtue of repetition. So just be mindful of that. There's a video here too that's a pretty good one to watch, and watching it from them. These videos don't take too long, so I would encourage you guys to do that. All right. Different ways to put CSS into your documents. And so this is probably where I'm going to start coding. But let's talk through these first, and then I will do some demos on how to make them actually happen. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so we can get the content in there. Now, ultimately, the best way to really do CSS, and I think most professionals would agree with this, is that you create a separate text file, once again, plain text like HTML, put it into the same folder structure, and link it through the head section of your document. So if you remember, our HTML documents have like a head section at the top where we put like the title and the character set and whatever. Styles can go up there too. Usually we create a link to the CSS file and we use the keyword link. We use this, and I don't know if this is a relation or relative or what that means exactly. I always think of it as like a relation. What's the relationship of this link? It's a style sheet, right? So, and this, real frankly, is not required. It's just considered good practice. But when you make accessible websites, I think that that's required. So just be mindful of that. Of course, I clicked in there and I lost my spot, so I apologize. I'm trying to find my spot. All right, there we go. All right, and then we have a link like we do when we do anchor tags to make links to the pages or whatever. We have an href that points to where the file is located. At least for basic HTML, I usually just put the CSS file right in the same folder with the HTML files. That's my practice. If I'm starting to build a website that's got, let's say I have 10 style sheets, because that does happen, sometimes I make a folder for the style sheets and put them all together in a folder, just so I can find them faster, right? So these are just tips, probably not ones you're going to use for this class. The other approach is to do what we call, the internal style sheet. Now, this part is the actual CSS code. So if I opened up that file, I would place this code inside of it, right? And so I'll demo that in just a minute. The other approach is what we call the internal or embedded style sheet, where you place two style tags inside the head section of your document. And then once you're inside those style tags, then you switch over to CSS syntax and just drop your styles in there. This is good because now I can control all the styles on a page, but only for that page. The external file, if I have a body tag, which I do on every page, obviously, all my pages will have a light blue background. So you see like the advantage of that, where if I do it here, only this page has it, right? during the homework, I do want you to demonstrate this technique on like one tag, just so you know how it works. And like, once again, there are times where you might not have control of the style sheet, but you have control of the page and you can inject styles. Really great example of this is if you guys were around in the MySpace days, and I am dating myself here. Everybody back then, it was an early social media platform, but everybody back then figured out like you could pimp your page by dropping style information like into a comment box, and it would propagate out. You'd have like flames on your page and daisies or whatever. It was pretty cool, right? It was like how a lot of people got into doing this as a profession, by the way. But that's basically an embedded style sheet. The other approach, notice it says use sparingly, and I agree with that, is to do what we call an inline style. So I can just take a tag, for example, like an H1 tag, say style equals, put in a pair of double quotes, and then just start typing out your styling commands like I would in a CSS external file, like the color, blue, notice the semicolon, text align center, notice the semicolon, and I'm glad they're closing it, right? Because it's not required that they close the last one, but it is the better practice. This would style just this H1, nothing else on this page, nothing else on any other page. Now, once again, its use is typically found like in content management systems where you can't control the other levels. And this also has a higher position on the cascade. So if you do an inline style, it'll supersede the embedded style at the top of the page, and the embedded one will supersede whatever's happening in the external file, right? So if you got people dropping in embedded stuff, or what do they call it, internal stuff, and doing inline, that can really mess up your style sheet. So like really the better approach is do all your styles in the style sheet. But once again, for the homework, I'm going to ask that you do this. So let's now get ready to do some of this in a coding kind of way here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my file management. So I'm here in my folder where I store my web work for this class for this semester. And as I did last week, I'm going to come in here. I'm just going to copy my Unit 3 folder, and I'm going to paste it back into the folder. And then I'm going to right click and rename it and use the very clever name of Unit 4. Right now, if you don't like that name, you can use whatever name you want. But to me, it makes sense. Like if this is the Unit 4 work, let's put it in the Unit 4 folder. Other people might want to name the folder whatever their website name is. That's fine. But if you're creating different versions each week, you might want to say like, Joe's homepage version 4 or whatever, just so you can keep the version separate. The other thing that why this is good, once again, just to refresh your memory, is I've just created a new version. So I'm not going to destroy anything. If I totally screw up what I'm doing now, I can go back to Unit 3 and start over and not have to rebuild from scratch. If you don't version your work, you always run that risk of never being able to step backwards and maybe not being able to fix it as well. All right, so now I have my Unit 4 stuff here. Since we're using Visual Studio Code, I'm going to open a different folder, right? And this time I'm going to open Unit 4, and I'm going to select that one. And then here is all my stuff. Now remember, this is a copy of Unit 3. I am just going to go ahead and get rid of the splash screen here. And then I'm going to make a determination, actually, by looking in my browser, which page I want to do my work on. And if you remember, I was working on this page, and I suppose I can probably do most of my work here today because there's enough content on here where I can actually style some of it, right? Our initial styling attempts are going to be styling most fundamental elements. I do have some recommendations here, though, before you get coding. And you'll notice here that in my code, and this was part of the Unit 3 assignment, right? Where we put semantic tags in, where I had put the header structure here, and then I had my navigation, and then I have the main content area, which goes all the way down to here, and then below that is the footer. What I would suggest, and this is something you should do early on, if you're going to use this structure, which is a very common structure for a lot of web pages, propagate that structure to all your pages. In fact, that's one of the homework tasks. So in other words, if I go to my about page, you'll notice that, well, my header is going to be the same on every page. Guess what I did? I just went to my index page and copied that, right, verbatim, and pasted it in my about page. And then I went in there and I added the main tags for all the content on that page. And then at the bottom, I added the same footer I had on the home page. All right, I'm going to copy that footer right now. Now I'm going to go to my contact page because this one's still missing that, right? So I want to build the structure for this page, the semantic structure, to be identical to all the other pages. So that way, when I decide to like change my navigation bar, for example, all the pages look the same automatically right away. Okay. Another thing that you might want to do is if you have a structure built, right, and I'll demonstrate that in a second, you can save one as and call it template. And then every time you create a new file, you can just open up that one, make a copy of it, and you have your structures already there, right? Makes sense, right? So you don't have to recreate a bunch of code. It's not really that hard to copy paste, I guess, but why not? So the one thing I did grab was the footer. So I'm gonna throw that in here. It's kind of a weird way to start from the bottom up, but sometimes I do that. It is on one end, right? I already determined that this was copied from the home page, and I'm going to grab the opening main tag with it. Why not? And then I'm going to put that on my contact page right here under the opening body tag. All right. Now I do want to close main, so I'm going to come way down here to the bottom, right above the footer. And notice how it auto-suggested I close it. And then I'm also going to do the trick, and I know I'm going quick here, so I don't mean to go too quick, where I'm going to format the document so it does all the indenting for me, right? So now I have the same structure on all the pages. Now, notice that the contact page is currently unsaved. My index page is saved. My about page is saved as well. If you have edits on multiple pages, it is possible to come up to the file menu and save all. That's a really common command, or just save the work on one page. Now, whichever page has the least amount of content, probably my about page, I'm going to right click and copy this. And then I'm going to right click and paste. And notice it listed as a copy, but now I'm going to rename it. And I'm going to call it template. This is not required, by the way. This is just a suggestion. And then I'm going to take this template, and maybe up here at the top, I'll even call it a template so I can identify it easily. And I'm going to get rid of the style tag because that's not what I want there. And then the header and the nav can stay the same, but everything in the content area is gone. But the footer is going to be the same. So you see like the idea here, right? Now I have a blank template. And if I hit save on this, when I create a new page, I can just open this up, do a save as, give it a different name, and I don't have to retype all this code. So that's really a great suggestion and a big time saver. Especially, and I'm going to say this, especially if you're happy with the design of what you have, right? You might decide later, and I'm probably going to, by the way, that, oh, I don't like that. So then if I change my header on this page, I'm probably going to have to change it on all the pages to make them consistent. If I add pages to my website, I'm going to want to add to the navigation links every time also. Right? So these are just kind of like logical ways that you create files. All right, so here's a template. I'm going to close this one. I'm not going to really mess with it much. Most of my work today is going to happen on the index page. And generally the reason why is because there's content here to mess with. So we're going to try something really basic, and then we're going to take a break. So the first thing we're going to try is we're going to work backwards in the cascade. We're going to start with the inline one, the one you're really not supposed to do, just so I can show you how it works. Then we'll take a break and come back and do more. So let's do something interesting here. Let's come up here to the H1 tag. No, this is probably not a good tag to do this. Let's do it on the H3 tag. And I'm just going to zoom in here just a little bit so it's easier for you guys to see. but you notice I added a space. Now I'm going to type the word style equals, right? So open and close the quotes. And notice how it's suggesting. It's exactly what I was going for. So I'm just going to click and accept it, right? So let's just do that. So I added style color green. Now, Visual Studio Code does you a solid, and they drop in this little color box. And I want you, now, this is really pretty slick. In the old days, we never had products like this. If we wanted to pick a color from a color palette, I'd have to go out to a website, and I'm going to show you some of those. And then I would like find the color, then I would write down the hex code, and then come back to my coding engine and type it in. But here, and this is really super quick demo. I can come in here and go, oh, you know, I really want it like more like this green, and I don't want it quite so bright. No, actually, I want it really dark. I want it to be like a forest green. And then notice how it changes the code into a different format. All right, so we haven't talked about that yet, so I'm not going to quite do that. So I'm going to Control Z that, Control Z, Control Z. We're going to stick with just green. So a really nice little basic one like that is actually a very good way to start. So I'm going to go ahead and do a Control S to save, and I think it's saved. And let's go back to the browser and take a look now. I'm going to refresh, and it did not work. And now we got to figure out the why. Oh, it didn't actually type it in. Okay, so that's the why. All right, that's okay. We'll practice typing it in just to kind of build up our typing skills. Now I'm going to do Control S to save, back to the browser, and a refresh. And I'm going to Control Shift R here. It still does not seem to be green, does it? Yeah, it does not. Wondering why. How about this? Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll reveal the why. All right, I'll see you guys in about 5 minutes. It's 8:34, 8:39. All right, so right before we went on break, you know, I made this like change in my code, and then I expected to come back here and see this text here turn green, and it didn't. And I kept refreshing, and I went back and I made sure it saved and my syntax is right. And what's really going on is I was looking at my Unit 3 version of the work, not the Unit 4 version of the work. Isn't that clever? So watch, I'm just going to change the URL here, right? Or I could relaunch it again, but, and there it goes. It's nice and green now, isn't it? Yeah. And it looks pretty good. So this is an example, once again, of inline style, right? And generally speaking, a discouraged approach, right? There are times, as we've discussed, that this is kind of the only approach that might be available to you when you're coding, which is kind of an interesting thought. All right, let's now work on the second approach, which is the internal, is what the lecture notes say, or as some people refer to it as embedded, which means it's at the top of the document in the style sheet. Now, if you guys remember, when we were doing our table last week, we kind of already played with this, so I'm not going to recode it. But here's an example where in the head of the document, we added a style tag. Notice that we addressed the table. And then notice if you want to apply the same style to multiple items, you put a comma in between those items. So we're applying it to the table, the TH tags, and the TT tags, right? And then inside the curly brackets, what are we styling? The border. That's not one we're really looking at today, but you can play with this. You know, you can add a border to just about anything in HTML. That's 1 pixel wide, a solid line, and is black. So that applies to all of these tags, but only on this page. Right? So if I have a table on a different page, these styles will not, or that table won't be affected by these styles. It will only work for the table on this page. So I really don't need to code that one because the example is there. All right, so the next thing that we're going to look at is now creating an external file. And let's do that right here in our file system. So you could go to your native file system inside of your operating system and create a new file. But let's just do it right here through the interface in Visual Studio Code. So as long as you're on the right folder, you can just hit the new file icon, or you can go to file new. So let's do that. So we're going to add a file and we'll give it a name. All lowercase is my preference on this. Styles is what I'm going to call mine. .css. Now, the file extension is important, mostly for us to be able to identify it as a style sheet when we're looking at it later. And that is the standard naming convention for all style sheets. Do you have to do it all lowercase? Absolutely not. Does it really have to have a CSS file extension? The truth is actually not, but it's really the better practice. So name it that, and then when you're done with it, you'll have the file, and let's go ahead and open it. And let's try our first like page-wide style. And I know you guys want to do like a background color, so we can do that, but we'll build up to that. I'm actually going to start by putting a style on, well, I was thinking paragraphs, but let's do it on H1s, for example. And notice I'll just say H1, opening curly bracket, and a closing curly bracket right away. So my habit, and this is one that I've built up over the years, is I type both the openers and the closers right away. Then I press enter to split them, and then start putting in my colors. I will go with the color green for right now, so I'm just going to press tab to accept it. And no, I don't want them to auto suggest more code. And I'm going to have to figure out how to turn that tool off permanently, I think. All right, so there's my color. It's just very annoying. It just keeps persisting. And this will apply to all the H1s. Now, if you look at your code, right, I will do a save on this. If you look at your code, let's find all the spots where we have H1s. And I think, okay, well, I have one here that's an H1 that's not in the header, right? So this might not really be a great design choice. But anything that's an H1 would be affected by that. So wherever it is in the page, irrelevant. To prove the point, I'm going to add another style right off the bat. So I'm going to put in a blank line. This time I'm going to put something on paragraphs. And once again, I'm going to create the curly brackets. And I like to create the opening and the closing ones right away and then split them. Right, and I'll repeat that. And it works better in different editors. This one seems to want to kind of like auto type everything for you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just stick with a color tag once again, but this time I'm going to choose a color. And I want you to notice what happens here in Visual Studio Code. It is pulling back now the list of all the color names that are pre-configured, right? You notice it's a very, very long list, right? And in the far margin here, it shows the hex codes, and we'll learn what those are pretty soon, of a color. So you don't have to choose green or whatever. Choose something that you think will look good on the white background that we have right now. So I don't know, maybe I'll go indigo. The Vikings fans are yelling at me right now, right? But just to prove the point, then we can see it. And we're going to do a Control S. Now I'm going to go to the browser for a moment, and I'm going to refresh my page. Am I going to see anything? No, you're not going to see a thing. Because, and here's the why on this, because the page has not been linked to the CSS file. So we need to do that aspect of it. So up here, I'm going to create a link tag, and notice it auto typed it for me. It knew what I was, it's probably listening to me actually. So we type in link, the rel tag, which is a style sheet. Like, what's the relation to this document? It's a style sheet. And then it points to the file. All right, now we're going to save it. Back over to the browser and refresh. Notice the big Green Bay Packers at the top is green. And, well, that's my only H1 on this page. So that turned green. And then my paragraphs, if you look really carefully, right, hard to tell, but this is purple, or indigo, actually. And then this, which is a block quote, is still black. But all my paragraphs, here's another paragraph, turn to that indigo color. Notice none of the rest of this stuff was affected. Only the things inside paragraph tags. Now, if I go to one of the other pages, for example, if I go to my contact page, I don't have any paragraphs here, but I do have, this is an H1 and this is an H1. Those didn't turn green. Why? Not connected to the style sheet. So what I can do here is take that link tag, copy it, and add it to each one of the other pages in the same fashion. Right, I'm going to put it down here at the bottom of the head section. I'm going to do the same for the about page. And now I have two files that aren't saved, so I'm going to do a save all. Go back to the browser and refresh. And now notice how both of my H1s have taken that style. And if I go to the about page, that one has two. Right? So that's pretty cool, right? So now here we are changing multiple pages all at the same time. If I prefer a different shade of green, I can now go to the style sheet. And I think one of the ones that suggested was dark green, right? I think that was a color, yep, dark green. And then we're going to press escape to not get that auto type code. I'm going to save. And then I want you to notice, watch the Green Bay Packer logo. It's a little darker. That looks more like the Packer color, right? And then if you go to the next page, they all have that same look and feel. Now, I am zoomed in at different levels on all these pages, but now you can see, and I'm like resetting my zoom. By the way, if your page is zoomed in, you can do Control-0 on that page, and that will reset you to 0, or you can come up here and set yourself back to 100. But the point is, right, that if my pages are consistent, this content up here at the top and the navigation, when I click a link, you know, those look like they almost don't change because they're the exact same content, the exact same style. So you start to see how this is pretty cool. All right, next thing that we're going to do is let's go ahead and add a style for the body tag. So I'm going to create a little space up here at the top, and I'm going to type body, curly bracket, and then close the curly bracket, press enter to split them, and then I'm going to type background, I spell it right, dash color. And I don't know if you guys are picking up on this, but the moment I start to type a letter in this panel, and this is because this is a higher level tool, right? Notice that you can do a background color. There's just a plain background. There's image, position, repeat, size, clip, filter, and it goes on and on and on. There's so many different things. And once again, this is why you can't memorize it all, because there's just so much of it, right? And I am focusing on the background color. So that's all it's going to affect. And they're recommending light yellow. Should I trust the AI and just go with it? Yeah, I'm going to. I think that might actually be appropriate, right? So that the font is dark green, then a light yellow page, right? Kind of green goldish, right? All right, so now we're going to click save. Back to the browser once again and refresh. I'm on my home page, and notice the light yellow color. When I click to my other pages, all of them have the same color. All right, so this is part of your homework, folks, right? So this is really an easy one to kind of work on. So you want to experiment with colors. I do want to give you a couple of tips. Okay, so I know what a lot of you are thinking. It's like, yeah, you know, this is really good, but you know, I'm building a site and I want a dark theme, right? So you guys know where I'm going with this. Some of you might be guessing already. Like, what if I decide instead of saying light yellow, I just say black? Okay, let's save it. Let's go back to the browser and refresh. It worked. But what happened to all my black text? Did I delete it? No. Here's the thing. It is still there. And this is kind of one of the lessons that you have here with working with colors. When you make a change like this, don't freak out and go, oh my God, I just deleted all my text. No, you didn't. It's still there. You just can't see it. So now I got to do the due diligence of changing all the font colors to a different color to make it appear. So I can do that actually on a page level, right? So if I put something inside the body tag, I can declare that the color for all the fonts on the page by default will be whatever color I decide them to be. And maybe it's, I don't know, it has to be something that looks good on top of black. So I'm going to choose, I don't know, antique white. Let's just go with that. Right, it's sitting right there. So I'm going to save it. Now we go back and refresh, and now you can see the text. So one of the challenges that you work with is you will change the appearance of one thing, and then it affects the appearance of something else. But the general rule of like getting stuff on the screen is if you want your words to be readable, they should contrast highly with the background. Okay, so I'll give you an example of that because I could, you know, I mean, this is okay. I'm not sure it's appropriate for the Packers, right? I'm probably going to switch it to a different color. But I get people who would like, for example, will say, well, I want my font to be like a dark gray. And that's not really a dark gray, but you can make it like super, super dark. This will actually probably look okay, right? It's not that dark. But I could make that gray so dark that you could barely even read the words. Right? This is still kind of readable. There's a lot of discussion that you'll get from people about these types of things. Like, for example, whenever you're working with primary colors and you're putting them on the screen, and you'll notice this is a primary color here, it's just straight blue. That's a little hard to look at, isn't it? Especially on the black background, because there's not a lot of contrast between this and the background. And the indigo's kind of hard to read as well. So you got to like, you know, if your background's one way, fonts have to be light. If your background's light, your fonts need to be dark. They don't have to be like black and white, although real frankly, that's one of the most readable formats, right? Is black and white, or the flip, white on top of black if your background's black. So play with that. Contrast is really important for readability. Depends on who your audience is as well. So I'm going to go back and I am going to flip these. So I'm just going to do a Control Z here, right? And I'm going to get rid of the color and I'm going to switch that back to a light yellow. I thought that was actually pretty good. All right, and we'll save it. Now I'm going to move forward in the lecture materials. And let's do a refresh here to make sure it's stuck. All right, so this is kind of more normal-ish looking, so we'll just kind of work with that for now. Now, there's a rule as to how you actually put together the syntax for CSS. And there's a terminology that we also kind of use for building CSS styles, basically. When we use a tag name from HTML, so for example, here you see the paragraph tag and it's just the letter P. This technically is what we call a selector. It selects which item on the page we're applying the style to, right? So I can indicate the name of the tag. Later on, we're going to learn about class declarations and IDs, right? And this is the format of a class. This is the format of an ID. And then, and real frankly, I mean, I'll give you a preview on it, is basically I can add the name of a class, which can be shared by many items on a page, and style all those items collectively, even if they're different tag types, by adding a class statement. We'll learn that in upcoming units. With an ID tag preceded by a pound sign, I can apply an ID to one item on a page and then uniquely apply a style to it. Classes and IDs are something that are very important, not just for styling, but also for coding. But for right now, we're sticking with just declaring a tag name for the selector. We will learn that there's a real rich library of syntax you can use for CSS selectors. That kind of came about with the latest version of HTML5 and CSS 3.3 or something like that. I think the version number is, where you can get really specific in your selectors inside the style sheet to like narrow down weird little aspects of it. They also have what they call the declaration block, and that's basically everything that's inside the curly brackets. So you got to be careful with this. Whenever you open those curly brackets, make sure you close them. And you see this format that I've been following where you do the selector, open the curly bracket, put your styles in there, each style on its own line, and then close the curly brackets. That format is pretty universally standard. And most designers tend to use it in their files. Some people do, by the way, and I'll point this out. They'll declare selector, curly bracket, and then they'll put their styles in one long line on one line. And they do it just to save space. Computer doesn't care. We do it like this because it's easier to see the list of styles that you're working with. All right, so that's the declaration block. Everything between the curly brackets. Then we have the actual declaration, right? Or the actual style that we're working on. The first part of it is the property. So which thing do you want to change? I want to change the color of the font. I want to change the size of the font. I want to change which font I'm using, right? And those would be declared on the left. You put in a colon, and then you put in whatever value can be, or whatever value is valid for that type of style. So for example, if I'm declaring a color, I can list it by name or via a number of other more advanced methods, right? Like RGB and hex and a couple of other things. When I'm doing sizes, I can refer to those in a few different formats as well. Percentages, fixed pixel sizes, relative sizes, etc. But what's appropriate for a value is dependent upon what style or what property you're working with. So there is a very rich library of these things. You will never memorize them all, ever, right? Unless you use them all the time, which is pretty rare. So you tend to get into the habit of knowing certain things really well and other things you have to look up, and that's okay, right? But there is a way to do just about everything if you have the right syntax for it and the right styles that you're selecting. So let's take a really quick look here on W3 Schools about the syntax issue, right? And here they break it down. So the selector, the curly brackets, right? The property, the value. Property and values are separated by colons. Each declaration is separated with a semicolon. So notice how they're putting it all on one line here, right? And that's a technique people do use. Yeah, I think we've covered that pretty well at this point. So let's move on. Let's just add another style just to kind of keep things interesting here. How about with our H1? In fact, here, let's do kind of an interesting one because I'm thinking about the header area of my pages, like this stuff up here. And I'm thinking to myself, that's kind of nice that's over to the side like that, but wouldn't it look better if it was in the middle? So let's put it in the middle and let's learn how to do that. So we're going to just do a little bit of basic alignment here. Now, I do want that to apply to the H1 tag. So for example, I could put my alignment tag, text-align, :center, that's the correct tag, here. And then I could save it. Let's go take a look so you see that it'll move that H1 to the middle. But you know what? I think I might want to have all of my header stuff and my navigation and my footer all on the left. Or, excuse me, all in the center. Right. So do I have to declare each one separately? There is a way to actually combine tags. So I can say my H1, my H2, my H3, and my footer. And I said my nav too. It's my nav. Also, I want those to align. So they have it right here. So I do want to use text align center. So text align center, and I'll just accept that. Like that, and save it. And then, of course, if I'm listing it here, I don't need to list it up here. So this is like one of the little tricks too. So I'm going to remove it from there and save it. Now, I did break my code. How do I know that this is red? How do I fix it? I put a closing curly bracket here. Let's save this. And then let's go back and do a refresh and check out all the stuff that moved to the center. Now, granted, the table off to the left doesn't look great. Did the style propagate to the other pages? Yes. If you want to experiment, and I'm encouraging you to do this, another thing you might choose to do, and this is just me right now, right? And mind you, I'm probably going to change all this stuff as we move forward, is I might take my navigation and make it a different colored background. I was thinking about doing that, and gosh, I'm struggling with this auto type tool quite a bit if you guys aren't noticing. I'm going to accept both of these, but padding is something we haven't talked about yet. So I'm going to press escape to get that out of there. But I'm going to put a different background color on my navigation. And light gray might be not exactly what I'm shooting for, but I'll just go with it just to show you that I can take this now, the navigation bar, hard to select it. I'm going to refresh and notice how it's got a different background color. Right. Granted, it's not beautiful yet. We're working on that part. But I do now have a navigation bar on every page, however primitive. And I don't know if you guys are feeling where I'm going with this, right? But every time, it's like, okay, now I want to put this here. All right, now I did that. Now I want to put a background on. Okay, I did that. And every time I make a change, I go look and see if I like it. And granted, there's many, many different things I can do here to make this continue to look better. But right now, we're just trying to get the feel of how the tools work. So please experiment and try to grab colors and stuff that are good for you. Notice that, some of the styles maybe didn't work out quite so well, like putting like all the H3s in the center, because that would have looked better over here. You guys feel where I'm going with that? So like, you really do have to play with this stuff and be careful when you apply stuff up here, because it does apply to everything on every page and it might not be what you want. So fair warning. It's one of the little frustrations that you learn. There are methodologies for fixing this, and right now that's not really the focus. But I think for now, I mean, these are kind of okay, but maybe there's a better way to do this. My H1 and H2 and H3 on my page, the reason I selected those, right, is because they're all in the header. Maybe I could put the text align center on the header instead of the H1 tags. How about that? Interesting. All right, so let's play with that and see what happens. So I'm going to get rid of the text align center here, or maybe the smarter way to do it is, why don't I get rid of these and type header here, right? Leave the style alone, save it. Let's go back and take a look, and then notice what happened. Okay, so these went back to where they were, and that's still centered. So that was the better maneuver for not breaking the look of the whole site. So all three of these are contained by the header tag. So this is one of the reasons why we use semantic HTML in containers, is because with one command, I control everything inside of it. And if I want the header, the footer, and the nav to have a different color background, well, once again, let's do a background color, and let's do, I don't know, what would look good there. I don't know, let's just pick this color just for the heck of it. I'm gonna save it, and then let's refresh. Okay, maybe not so good, right? But this is what's gonna happen, right? So like, okay, you'll play with stuff and go, hey, I don't like that color. And then you'll end up playing with the color palette. And if you guys want and to play with the newer techniques that we haven't learned with yet, I mean, you can do that. So like, you can just pick a color that just appeals to your eyes. And maybe I'll go with something like that, and just save it. And we'll learn about that code later and just refresh and just see if you like it. Okay, once again, bad choice, right? So If you don't like any of the choices you're making, maybe just Control Z your way out of it, but there's no harm done in playing with it. That's my grand point. Let's move on now, because time is very quickly waning here if you're not picking up on that. And look at some of these things that we've been playing with already. The color one is really kind of a weird one, right? Because it was one of the first CSS tags that was developed, and they were like, well, how do we change the font color? I don't know, let's come up with a color style. And then, you know, when I think of like changing the color of a font, I would think that the style should be called font color, right? But it's not. It's just called color. So just wrap your head around that. That color affects the text only. Notice when I do background color, that'll affect backgrounds. But notice when I want to do font sizes and font families, those all, generally all the font settings are prefaced with a font prefix and then the aspect of it that comes in handy. One thing that people do like to do on web pages is they like to, at least in their body tag, set a default font size and a default font to use for the whole page. And you can override it in specific areas later. So here's an example. In the body tag here, they're declaring two different things, or actually three different things, right? So they're declaring which font, and I want you to notice these are grouped in a family, right? So instead of using the default font for the browser, which by the way is Times New Roman, and that's true for all browsers, we're going to pick a different font family, and here's one that you can borrow from. If your system, and the way that they structure these, if your system doesn't have that font, then it will use the standard sans serif font that matches it. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the other thing they're doing is they're making all of the font sizes 18 pixels. Now, by default, the default font size on a web page is 16 pixels, by the way, for paragraph text. So this would make the fonts a little bigger. I'm a fan of that, by the way. I like that. Why make it hard to read, is my thinking. And then they're choosing a color, and notice it's not black. This is a dark gray color, and you can copy this code exactly if you wish. So I'm going to copy this right now. And of course, because I'm doing it in this weird window. And now you guys see all the like weird code there. You know what? I can just type this stuff. All right, let's just go in there and type it. So on the body tag, let's start with font family. And I want you to notice, once again, Visual Studio Code has a bunch of them built in already. There's no harm done in experimenting. Some of the more standard ones that you'll see, by the way, Times Roman, Times and Serif. And the layout of this, by the way, just to give a little clarity, the first one's intended for PCs, the second one's intended for Macintosh, and the third one is the generic font class that will load whatever the default is on the system. Times Roman is a serif font because it has little decorations on it. The ones that are sans serif and that like these don't have those decorations. So if you want, for example, I'm going to choose this one: Verdana, Geneva, Tahoma, sans serif. And once again, what it's going to do is it'll first look for Verdana. If it's not there, it'll load Geneva. If that's not there, it'll load Tahoma. And then if that's not there, okay, give me whatever sans serif you got. Most modern machines will have the first font, by the way. And if they don't, they'll have the second. So there's a font family. Then we're going to choose a color. And we are going to do a really, really dark gray. And I think they did a pound sign and then 3 or 6 sixes or 6 threes, actually. And then close it with a semicolon. It's a very dark gray. You can see it on the color chart. Not quite black, right? Very, very dark gray. And then the other thing that they were playing with was font size. And I like the recommendation of the 18px, which stands for pixels. So we'll go with that too. So I'm going to save that. Now I'm going to go back to the browser once again and do a refresh. Right, we're going to see a lot of stuff change here, by the way. There's a refresh, right, because I reset my header. But notice the font. Okay. It looks a little more modern, right? You may or may not like it. And if you don't like the font, try one of the other font families. Now, the ones that they were auto suggesting inside the product are pre-configured. You don't have to follow those. You can, if you know the names of your fonts, you can type them in directly. It is also possible, and this is once again a higher level skill, but it's possible. And I'm going to use the materials here to kind of take us to that material. Okay, so we talked about colors, backgrounds a little bit, and fonts, and I'm not going to dig into these topics super deep today because we're almost out of time. But I do want to show you here with fonts that there are ways, right, to select fonts that are considered better for the web. And they tend to call these web safe fonts, like ones that you know will be in every browser. So the ones that were auto suggesting inside of Visual Studio Code are auto suggesting because they're web safe. In other words, almost every web browser you're going to load is going to have that font. So it's going to look exactly the way you want. Great, right? That's what you want. You want it to load up the way that you want it. The ones that are listed after the first one, those are called fallbacks. So like if Tahoma doesn't load, we fall back to Verdana. If Verdana doesn't load, we fall back to sans serif. There is a way, and some of you will be smart enough to figure this out right away, to go to the Google font library. They have a whole library of free fonts. You can add a link to their API and the specific font you want, and then declare that font in your styles. So you can get like really hyper specific fonts. And think about this. If you're loading your website out on the web, chances are people can pull down the Google font because it's not loading it from your system or their computer. It's loading it from Google servers. Right. So this is a possibility. Nothing you have to try right now. Later on, though, you will find yourself in situations that will be very specific, right? And want you to be very, like, I don't know, I'm making a Halloween website and I want the creepy font or whatever, then there's fonts like that. Or I'm making a Star Trek fan website, and yeah, there's Star Trek fonts too, right? That you can download, and you can make it look just like Star Trek or Star Wars or whatever, just be mindful of that, and you can read through this. Our goal today is just to stick once again with the basics and just to get you rolling. When it comes to working with colors, all right, so I am going to click through the color section now. Colors can be declared in a number of different ways. And the one we've been playing with already is you type in the color property, and then you can start choosing different colors. And here's some examples, right? And it can get very, very colorful. And they have come up with 140 standard color names. And I'll just open that up in a new tab. And you can just look through here if you want a chart, right, of what they look like. Go, oh yeah, hot pink, that's perfect for the Green Bay Packers, right? Or whatever, you can come in here and pick it. Notice that all of them have right below a hex code. This is called a hex code. And what a hex code is, right? So that's one way of doing color. And a hex code actually was the original way we did color on the web. And Rachel, I'm kind of looking at you. Probably the last time you took this class with me, that's probably how we were doing it, and all this other stuff is kind of brand new. But basically what you do is you use these codes here, and just to show you how this is broken down. Okay, what's hex all about? Hex means that instead of using a base 10 number system, you're using a base 16 number system, where it uses all the numbers from 0 to 9 and then A through F to cover the numbers 10 through 15, right? So the base 16 number system has numbers from 0 to 15, and an F is basically equivalent to 15. Two F's together are 255 is what that, and basically what it is pairings of colors. So this represents the red color in the color. The second two represent the green colors in the color, and the last two represent the blues. So it's RGB. First two are red, second two are green, last two are blue. And when we work on the screen, and here's an example, The color that you get is really a mixture of how strong any one of these other colors is. And you can see like by just altering the slider, how many infinite possibilities there are. And what this is doing is it's mixing it live on the screen for us and then giving us the hex code to get that very specific color. So one way to do this is to find a tool called the color picker. And this one's right here on the screen, right at W3, right? But you can also, and I'm just throwing this out there, there are websites, and I think actually the Google browser does it now. This is a color picker just built right into Google that you can do the same thing, kind of like the one in Visual Studio Code. Notice at the bottom of this screen, right, that whatever color I pick here, right, it will give me the hex code. Also, it gives me the color code in 4 other formats. The two that, you know, that people, the weird ones that the two that get used most often, frankly, are RGB, which I consider probably the most user-friendly one, because you don't have to try to backtrack what these numbers mean in base 16, because it's not the same as base 10. You just see them as regular numbers. These numbers go from 0 to 255 in all of these positions, which indicates the strength of each color. 0 is none, 255 is full on, right? There's also CMYK, which is typically used more for printing, right? So like if you were in a print shop, you use CMYK colors. And I forget what these all mean. I think it's cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, I think is what it is. Then you also have HSV, which is hue, saturation, and whatever the last one is, I forget. So see like what I mean? Like you can't remember all this stuff. And then you have HSL. So these are just all, that one I know is hue, saturation, and lightness. And I forget what the V stands for here, but you can figure it out. But why would you use these other ones? Well, if I was creating HTML and I was expecting it to be printed, and I got the print color codes from my magazine print shop, and they said we use this CMYK, you could dial that in exactly and match your print materials. That's the why. The other two approaches here are usually for on-screen, mostly broadcast television and stuff and streaming things. But for the web, we use hex and we use RGB or the plain text titles. There's a bunch of different color pickers out there. These are some base level ones, but Visual Studio Code has it built in too. So it's really easy to find a color you want without even leaving the product. And most better editors are kind of in that mode. The RGB, which is kind of like the one that I like to use the most these days, mostly because most of the tools do it, are just basically, once again, red, green, blue. You can have an optional 4th parameter for opacity, which is transparency, but that'll come later. That one is called RGBA, and the A stands for alpha, or how transparent something is. So play with those formats. You can use words, hex codes, and RGB for now. If you want to try the others, you can as well, but I would call those pretty advanced. So stick with hex, RGB, and color names, generally speaking. All right, let's go back here to the luxury stuff. Sorry for all the scrolling, folks, but we're getting there. One thing you'll also discover, once again, not doing it this week, is backgrounds don't have to just be colors. We can put images in the background. We can have repeating images and tiled images, and we can take those images and place them in certain spots in the background as well. And I think in some of the CSS examples we saw early on, we even had backgrounds where you would scroll down the page and the background was staying in one spot. All of that is totally doable and easily achievable. Once again, advanced skills coming up in subsequent weeks. All right, just about to finish up our luxury stuff here. We're going to talk about what we call the cascade and specificity and inheritance. All right, and these are some heady words here, but the cascade in essence defines which style declaration takes precedent over the other. And the way this works is the one at the bottom of the list has more importance than the one at the top. Now, mind you, when we write HTML and we don't declare style, the browser has built-in defaults for whatever thing you're putting. If you have a paragraph, it's got a default Times Roman 16 pixels. If it's a header, it's bigger, bolder, more space around it. Those are built into the browser. So we usually don't like what the browser does natively. So then we put in an external style sheet. And that really is the preferred approach generally, right? So that controls everything on every page. And you can change multiple pages at once. You use the link tag for that one. Then there's the internal style sheets where you put the style tag at the top of the document, but it only affects that page. And then, of course, we did the inline styles, which are directly on the tag. And that takes precedence over the others. So if you're at the bottom of the list, it will override whatever these are doing. If I'm here, it'll override these two. If I'm here, it'll override that. So people like to use the external approach and skip these at the bottom whenever they possibly can, because then you don't have to worry about the cascade as much. But the cascade also extends into what we call specificity, which is how you put your style tags together. Now, some of this is a little more advanced than where we're at right now. But for example, we already learned how we do elements. And so once again, the stuff at the bottom, is more specific than the stuff at the top. So this is the highest priority. This is lowest priority. So this, if I wanted to style a paragraph or H1, right? And this is a very typical approach. We'll take certain tags and style them a certain way. But sometimes I might have a paragraph where I want most of my paragraphs to look like this, but this one paragraph, this one's about the bears, so we want to make that one, more bear-like or something, so we would use maybe different colors, or we want to get people's attention on it. And we'll use a class statement, which is an identifier that can be shared by multiple items. And I talked about this earlier. We can also use an ID tag to target one particular item. And then we can use inline styles, right, which are part of the cascade above. When we start to get into class statements, just take a look at this here. So I can create a paragraph that I want to highlight. So I'll give it a class name of highlight, and then I'll apply a very specific style to highlight in my style sheet, and then that particular thing will work. And notice that when I look at the CSS file, how I would declare that, classes will be prefaced with a period, and then we want to highlight it, so we'd make that colored blue. And even though most paragraphs are red, that one would highlight blue, right? And this is something that we can demonstrate here pretty quickly. In fact, really, I could copy that code once again. I should have known it was going to do that. Right? Because it goes, I'm in Brightspace and it goes into this weird edit mode when I do that. But I can grab that. I think it highlighted, so we'll see if it pastes in correctly. So down here at the bottom, I'm just going to paste this in. Okay, it didn't. All right, so let's just do that. Okay, so right now all my paragraphs are indigo, which we'll leave alone. But I will create a class name called highlight. And no, I don't want to do a background color yellow. I just want to do a color, and blue is fine, right? Just to kind of make the point. I'm going to save this. Now, of course, on my web page, somewhere, and I'm going to do this on the index page, I want to find one snippet of text that I want to highlight. How about the block quote? That might be a good one. So here I'm going to add a class name. And here I don't put the dot in front, but notice it's finding highlight in my CSS library. And when I save this and go back and look at it in the browser, if I can find it, this block quote, which is this section here, when I refresh, will now be blue. What's neat about a class is if I have multiple paragraphs that I want to highlight, I can do that. This is not part of the assignment, by the way, but this is coming, Class can be used multiple times on one page, is what I always tell people. All right, let's wrap up the lecture here, because I think we are at the bottom of that document. We did make it through all the material. Yes, we did. All right. All right. So the last little tidbit here is this concept of what we call inheritance. Now, because an HTML page has a hierarchy of structure. So for example, the page has opening and closing HTMLs. We have a head section at the top, a body section at the bottom. The head holds the non-visible stuff. The body holds all the visible stuff, right? And then I'm putting tags inside of it, right? So then I have a header, and then inside the header, I have all these H1s, right? And when I figured out that I could put my centering on the header instead of putting it on each one of these and blowing up the rest of the page, that's because the stuff inside the outside tag, or what we call the parent tag, is inherited by the child tags inside of it, right? So if I set the font on my header to be, pick a font, then all the ones inside there, whatever elements are inside there, will inherit that feature from the header style. And I can demonstrate that one quickly enough. You know, so for example, well, here, I'm not going to change all these others, so I'm going to list header separately. I'll do header, curlies, and then let's just say font family, and let's just pick something different. I don't know. You know, there's so many. Let's do impact, which I'm usually not a fan of, and we'll save that. But notice now, when we go back to the page and refresh, watch the header, right? Which fonts is it going to change in the header? All of them, right? So here's the refresh. I'm not saying that's a good design choice, but it's an example. And it worked because the H1, H2, and H3 are all child elements of the header tag. So they're inheriting, you know, kind of like the DNA of the header tag or its style. And then if I wanted to like change maybe this one back to a different font, then I have to say H1 inside the header, right? And there's a whole syntax for that. It can be this one, right? So there's kind of like layers to this, but the inheritance thing is very powerful to understand. That's why we often, when we're designing pages, what we'll do is we'll set in the body tag the default font for the whole page, the default font color, and the default font size. And then when you get down to things like, I don't know, the H1 tag, or maybe the paragraph tag is a better example, and I want to like change the size of all the fonts at once, I don't have to declare pixels. I can just say make it 150% bigger than the default size, you know, that type of thing. And we'll learn how to do that coming up, but we've already absorbed a lot of material here tonight, folks. So we're going to wrap it right here. In terms of the assignment for this week, and I am going to pull it up on screen here really quick while I'm recording. I kind of have like a task list, and this is kind of how I do these assignments. So I tell you to make folders, copy them, make sure you have the semantic structure, make your navigations consistent. One inline style, demo it. One embedded style, demo it. Make an external file. Hopefully you already did it while you were watching me. Link it up to all your documents, and then do the following things. And if you've been following along, your homework is kind of done already, right? Not that you like the choices that you made, right? But that's not really the point right now, is to make it look awesome. It's just to get it to work. So background color of the body, background color of at least one other element, you know, so I chose my nav, right? Font color and size of headings and paragraphs. Use a text-align center somewhere, right? Change the font of all pages using font family, and specific ones to several elements of your choice. So you can use different fonts in different places. There's no real rules, right? Just whatever looks good. And then ensure that all the content is still visible once backgrounds are in place, right? So like, you know, it's kind of a black text on a black background. It's not very good, you know, so make sure that stuff is readable. Make sure all your structures are good and your CSS is good. And, you know, they have a HTML validator. They also have a CSS validator, right? We are at the point now where I do require you to upload your stuff to the Prometheus server. And if you are getting stuck on that, please send me an email. A couple people today sent me an email, so it always makes me when I get like more than one, you know, thing on the same day, I'm wondering if something's going on with the server. So I did pop a message out to Christian, who runs our server, just to check on it to see if we have a certificate error again or something like that. But if you do struggle with the FTP, please reach out to me. I'll gladly help you with it, or go back and watch the FTP videos as a refresher. At this point, your stuff should be inside nested folders. The other thing that I will point out is that just above the assignment, I've put in a link now to all the examples I've been doing in class, and every week I will update it. Yes, it's a plain HTML page, but if you want to see like the Unit 2 stuff, right, or you want to see the Unit 3 stuff, which basically looks the same, but I have like a contact form and a table, right? And granted, the work's not perfect, but you know, if you're watching the Unit 2 video and you want to see like the code I created during that session, the code I created today will get uploaded here. I'll have that out there probably by tomorrow. In fact, it's actually pretty easy to do. I can probably do it now. And then the link will be functional, and everything I did in class, you can go in there, for example, look at the page, right click, view source, look at how I did it. And, you know, if need be, copy it and tweak it and make it your own, right? That's not cheating. That's the way web people work, right? It's also the way I typically grade your work. So if you guys need help along the way on any of this stuff, please send me an email and I'll help you code through it. Have a wonderful night, everybody. This recording ends here.